Imagine an organization that, well, takes in over $8 billion of taxpayer money.
Right. A
Right.
massive amount of public funds.
Exactly. And on top of that, they operate this massive media empire, and they directly influence the health and, the social behavior of millions of people.
Oh, absolutely.
But then, when you actually ask to see how they run their boardroom, they look you in the eye and tell you they're entirely immune to outside rules.
Which sounds crazy, but for over a century, that was pretty much the global sports industry.
It really was. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are wading into the surprisingly dramatic, kind of high-stakes world of sports governance.
Yeah, a world that historically operated on handshakes, gentlemen's agreements, and just an incredibly fierce resistance to any sort of external oversight.
We're taking you, the listener, right behind the scenes. Because we like to think of sports as this pure, measurable thing on the field, right?
Right, the score is the score.
Exactly. But the business of running them behind closed doors has historically been just the absolute definition of institutional muddy waters. So we are uncovering how the sports sector is essentially being forced to grow up.
Yeah, they're having to transition from this outdated old boys network to a modern, genuinely accountable industry.
And to do this, we've got a really great stack of sources today. We're looking at the Guidelines for Good Governance in Grassroots Sport by ISCA and Transparency International,
We've also got the universal standards from the Sport Integrity Global Alliance, or SIGA.
plus a massive 2019 comprehensive report by ICSA called The Future of Sports Governance Beyond Autonomy. And this really insightful 2026 article from TidyHQ focusing on something called Tone from the Top.
Yeah, that TidyHQ piece really ties the whole thing together.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because more importantly, we're looking at why all the beautifully written rules in the world mean absolutely nothing without the right leadership culture. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, we have to start by understanding this concept that has basically dominated sports for generations. In the academic and legal sources we're looking at, especially that 2019 ICSA report, they call this the specificity of sport.
Right, I saw that phrase in the reading and it just struck me as incredibly arrogant.
Oh, it really is.
Splendid isolation. Like they genuinely believed they were a completely special case.
They absolutely did. It's this entrenched belief that sports organizations exist in a state of splendid isolation, immune to normal business rules. To illustrate how deep this goes, there's this fascinating statement from 2006 issued by European sports federations.
Okay, what did they say?
They confidently declared that sport is a social, educational, and cultural good.
Yeah.
And they explicitly stated it is not a regular business.
Wow.
Yeah. They were essentially arguing that because sport, brings communities together and teaches teamwork to kids, it just shouldn't be regulated like a bank or a massive corporation.
It's rooted in that whole Victorian gentleman amateur ideal. Which sounds like a lovely sentiment, and so you look at the modern reality. I mean, sport is not a quaint weekend hobby anymore.
Not at all. It is a multi-billion-dollar economic powerhouse.
Right. The illusion of being just a cultural good completely shatters when you look at the actual money involved.
And numbers are staggering. I mean, if we just look at the data ICSA compiled for the London 2012 Olympic Games alone.
Just that one event.
The UK's central government poured £6.25 billion into it.
Good grief.
And on top of that, there was another £2 billion sourced directly from the National Lottery.
So over £8 billion of public funds.
Yep. And despite absorbing all of that, the federations running these events still demanded total autonomy from government oversight.
See, to me, that is like a teenager demanding a massive, no questions asked weekly allowance from their parents, but absolutely refusing to accept a curfew or even tell them where they're going at night. I mean, if sports organizations want billions in public tax money and they're negotiating these massive multinational TV deals, how can they reasonably expect zero oversight?
Well, the short answer is they can't. And that is the paradox that finally broke the system. Because governments aren't just funding sports so people can have a fun Sunday afternoon.
Right, they have an agenda.
Exactly. They're funding sports to solve massive societal issues.
Wait, what do you mean by that? How does a government use sports to solve a societal issue?
Well, think about the concept of social prescribing in healthcare.
Okay.
Doctors in many countries are literally prescribing community sports participation to patients.
Like instead of medication.
Yeah, exactly. To combat depression, obesity, or social isolation, they prescribe joining a local football club. Governments also use sports programs to reduce youth crime rates, or foster community cohesion in marginalized neighborhoods.
Oh, I see.
So you simply cannot hand billions of public dollars to an organization to solve a public health crisis while letting them operate their boardrooms in total unregulated secrecy.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, so the model had to shift from complete autonomy to what regulators now call earned autonomy or supported autonomy.
Earned autonomy, meaning you have to prove you deserve the independence by actually opening the books.
Right.
Which brings us to the regulators stepping in. And from what I read, they did not just ask politely.
Oh no, they brought out a very heavy stick.
Yeah.
In the UK, the government introduced the Code for Sports Governance, and this was a watershed moment because it was the first mandatory code that explicitly tied public funding to compliance.
So it was literally a comply or else scenario.
Exactly. Comply or we turn off the tap.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because whenever I hear the phrase mandatory compliance, I immediately picture a giant, soulless spreadsheet.
Gosh.
If you put a financial gun to an organization's head and threaten to cut off their money, don't you just create a robotic tick box culture?
That's a very valid point.
Like, does a perfect spreadsheet of compliance actually stop corruption? Or does it just make the corruption look, I don't know, more professional on paper?
And that is the exact danger highlighted in the Universal Standards Report released by SIGA.
Okay.
A mandatory code tied to funding is a blunt instrument. It absolutely forces structural change, yes. But forced compliance risks entirely missing true cultural maturity.
Because it's just about survival at that point.
You can mandate that an organization sets up an independent ethics committee,
Sure.
but having an ethics committee is completely useless if the people sitting on it are just rubber stamping the bad behavior of their friends in the executive suite.
Right, which happens all the time.
Which happens all the time. That's why SIGA pushes for a phased implementation, bronze, silver, gold standards to actually build culture over time using a peer-to-peer approach.
So, if forced compliance doesn't immediately change the underlying culture, how do you actually fix the system? What happens when an organization just, calls the government's bluff? Because surely someone tried to fight back against these new rules.
Oh, they did. Table Tennis England did exactly that, and the fallout was incredibly revealing.
Oh, I read about this. What exactly went down?
Well, when the mandatory UK code was introduced, Table Tennis England held an annual general meeting, and their membership, the actual people who make up the sport, voted against adopting the necessary governance reforms.
Wow.
Yeah, they actively pushed back against the changes required to meet the new government standards.
So what did the funding body do? Did they just give them a slap on the wrist or a warning?
No, they suspended the funding entirely.
Well, just cut them off.
Just cut them off. The financial sword of Damocles dropped. Table Tennis England suddenly found themselves completely isolated from public money.
That must have been terrifying for them.
It sent an absolute shockwave through the sport. The panic was immediate because these sports rely on that funding for everything. Their elite programs, coaching, grassroots development.
Right.
So they had to scramble to organize an extraordinary general meeting just a few weeks later to force the reforms through and get their funding turned back on.
Wow. So that proves the regulators really weren't bluffing.
Not at all.
But I want to go back to what you said a minute ago about ethics committees rubber stamping bad behavior.
Yeah.
Because this takes us right into what the sources call the boardroom battleground.
Yes.
Who actually gets to make the decisions in these rooms? For a long time, if you looked at a sports board, it was incredibly insular, wasn't it?
Insular is an understatement. I mean, across the industry, this is known as the Blazers stereotype.
The Blazers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Historically, sports have relied almost entirely on former players and insiders to run the sport, usually older white men who literally wore the traditional federation blazer.
Right.
There was an active exclusion of outside business or governance expertise under this guise that outsiders just wouldn't understand the nuance of our game.
Yeah, you didn't play, so you don't get it. But if you're listening to this and you sit on a corporate board or even just your local homeowners association, you know what happens when a group gets too insular.
Exactly. Groupthink.
Groupthink sets in. And the statistics on this in the sports world are wild.
They really are. The 2016 data from the ICSA report paints a very stark picture of this capability gap. At that time, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic individuals, often referred to as BAME in UK demographics, made up 18% of sports participants.
Okay, 18% of participants.
Right. Yet they held only 4% of board positions.
That is a massive disconnect.
It gets worse. Out of 68 sports boards surveyed, there
Yeah.
was exactly one BAME chair and one CEO.
Out of 68 boards.
Yep. And the representation for individuals identifying as disabled was even worse, sitting at just 3% of board members.
That is just, wow, the blazer mentality of numbers right there.
Exactly.
You know, when I was reading about this total reliance on former players, an analogy hit me.
Oh, yeah.
It's like letting the actors run the entire movie studio,
Oh, that's good.
right? Because sure, they know how to hit their marks, they know how to deliver a line, they know the craft of acting perfectly, but do they know how to negotiate a complex multinational distribution deal?
Usually, no. And the consequences of that mismatch are showing up in the bottom line.
How so?
Well, the ICSA report points out that Sky Sports saw a 19% drop in Premier League viewership around that period, and 54% of younger audiences freely admit to illegal streaming.
Right, the consumer landscape is shifting massively toward digital fragmentation.
Exactly. And if your board is entirely made up of former athletes whose primary qualification is that they played the game 30 years ago,
Yeah.
how are they going to navigate complex digital piracy algorithms or changing mobile viewer habits? They just don't have the technical skill set.
No, of course not.
But here's the thing. The capability gap regarding broadcasting rights is only the financial side of the problem.
Right.
The cultural cost of the old boys club is far, far more severe.
You're talking about the scandals.
Yes. The lack of diversity and true independence on these boards is a direct mechanism driving the massive scandals sweeping through global sports.
The horrific allegations of systemic abuse, the bullying, the state-sponsored doping,
Exactly.
because it creates an echo chamber where nobody feels empowered to challenge the status quo. I mean, if you owe your entire career to the head coach who is now sitting across from you in the boardroom, you aren't going to call out his abusive training methods.
You're just not. And that is exactly why the government code started mandating that at least 25% of directors must be entirely independent.
Oh, so that's where the mandate came from.
Yeah, and 30% gender representation. The ICSA report brings up Baroness Tanny Gray Thompson's duty of care review.
I read that part. It essentially forces sports to answer the most critical question they face today, right?
Exactly. What is the correct balance between welfare and winning?
Yeah.
Because elite sport is inherently brutal. You are pushing human bodies and minds to the absolute physical limit.
And an independent director doesn't have historical loyalties to that specific locker room culture. They didn't come up through the ranks with the coaching staff.
Therefore, they are the only ones structurally empowered to ask the uncomfortable questions.
Right.
When an independent director looks at a training program that is physically breaking young athletes, they aren't blinded by the pursuit of an Olympic gold medal. They are tasked with protecting human safety over a toxic win-at-all-costs mentality.
But, you know, even if you get the perfect board, let's say you hit the 30% gender quotas, you bring in independent business experts, you ensure diverse representation, you still run into a massive, almost comical structural hurdle.
Oh, the implementation gap.
Yes. And this is where that incredibly insightful 2026 article from TidyHQ on Tone from the Top really blew my mind.
That's a great piece.
Because they point out that you can write the best ethical policies in the world at your national headquarters, but it means absolutely nothing if it doesn't reach the grassroots. They call it the distance problem.
It is the central defining dilemma of federated sports.
Explain that for the listener. How does the distance problem work?
Well, you have a highly professionalized chair or CEO sitting in a sleek, glass-walled national office in a capital city making all these rules.
Right.
But the actual governance of the sport, the weekend youth matches, the local financial disputes, the safeguarding of children that happens in local dank clubhouses hundreds of miles away.
Usually run entirely by unpaid volunteers.
Exactly. Unpaid volunteers who are just trying to keep the lights on.
And the failure of communication infrastructure here is staggering. The TidyHQ article talks about national sporting bodies spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to create a stunning 50-page PDF on corporate governance.
Oh, yeah. Beautifully formatted.
Yeah, beautiful. And then what do? They just email it to a generic address like info@localtownfootballclub.com.
Which is pointless.
Completely. It vanishes into a black hole. The volunteer who checks that inbox either doesn't care, doesn't understand the legal jargon, or, I don't know, forwards it to someone who left the club 3 years ago. It is completely useless.
It really is.
Yeah.
because structural rules fail without visible ethical leadership behavior that can actually be observed.
Right.
Governance isn't a PDF attachment. Governance is the accumulation of small, visible decisions made by leadership.
Yes.
The guidelines for good governance in grassroots sport, produced by ISCA and Transparency International, they hammer this point home. Culture is established by what leaders do when it is inconvenient.
Yes. The anecdote that TidyHQ CEO shared is a perfect illustration of this.
The boardroom walkout.
Exactly. So he was in a meeting with a state sporting body, and the chair of the board realized an upcoming procurement vote involved a company where his brother-in-law worked.
Okay.
Now, it was a tiny, barely material conflict of interest. Most people would have just shrugged it off, or maybe just abstained from raising their hand.
Right, just sat quietly.
But instead, the chair physically stood up, walked out of the room, and waited alone in the corridor while the rest of the board discussed and voted on it.
That single physical action is more powerful than any written 50-page policy.
Totally.
Because everyone else in that room saw the leader subject himself to a cumbersome, inconvenient process just to ensure absolute integrity.
It sets the tone.
Yeah.
But, okay, here's my pushback on that.
Go for it.
That works in a professional boardroom. But let's put ourselves in the shoes of a local volunteer.
Okay.
Imagine you, the listener, are hearing this, and you work a 40-hour week, you have young kids, and you volunteer on Tuesday nights to coach under-10s football.
Sounds exhausting.
Right.
Yeah.
You aren't getting paid. You have no HR department. You're probably buying the halftime orange slices out of your own pocket.
Yeah.
How are you supposed to care about corporate governance frameworks or SIGA compliance models or Transparency International guidelines?
It's a vital question because corporate tools do not map perfectly onto volunteer environments.
They just don't.
In a corporate setting, you have a compliance officer who can literally fire you if you break a rule.
Right.
In a volunteer club, there is no HR department. The only thing keeping people in line is the culture. Social norms completely replace corporate human resources.
The way we do things around here.
Precisely that. If the leader of that local volunteer club visibly follows a process, especially when it takes extra time, like ensuring 2 adults are always present when talking to a youth player, even if it delays practice.
Yeah, right.
It establishes a powerful social norm. The other volunteers see that, and they internalize it as the standard. But, and this is key, if the leader skips the process because it's raining and they are in a hurry, the written policy immediately becomes wallpaper.
Nobody cares anymore.
No one will ever follow it again. The tone is set by the exception, not the rule.
So how do we bridge that gap? Because we've established that emailing a 50-page PDF doesn't work. How does the rigorous ethical tone from the national chair actually reach that exhausted local volunteer coach?
The TidyHQ analysis highlights a really smart technological solution: role-based communication infrastructure.
Okay, what does that look like?
Instead of blasting an entire compliance manual to an info at inbox, modern platforms ensure that a specific message about financial compliance from the national treasurer goes directly to the phone of the local volunteer treasurer.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. A message about new safeguarding rules goes directly to the local welfare officer. It bridges the gap between national intent and local visibility, ensuring the tone actually hits the specific person who needs to hear it in a format they can digest.
It's taking these abstract bureaucratic rules and making them personal and targeted. And I think that brings this entire deep dive into focus for you, the listener. Because the lessons of sports governance apply everywhere. Whether you are prepping for a massive corporate boardroom meeting tomorrow, or you are running your local school's PTA, or you are just trying to fix a broken, toxic culture in your own office department. You cannot just write a 50-page policy, email it out to your staff, and walk away expecting things to change.
It simply does not work.
It doesn't.
Leadership is an active, ongoing demonstration. The era of blind trust is over. Transparency, accountability, and visible integrity are the new baseline for any organization seeking public trust.
You have to actually be the person who steps out into the hallway for the minor conflict of interest. You have to endure the inconvenience of doing it right, visibly in front of your team. You have to set the tone. So what does this all mean?
Well, it means we are watching a massive, sometimes painful evolution. The sports sector is finally looking in the mirror, realizing that they can no longer rely on the specificity of sport to shield them from the responsibilities of being a multi-billion-dollar global industry.
And it leaves us with one incredibly fascinating and kind of provocative thought to look toward the future.
Oh, yeah.
Because the sources noted that sports must rapidly adapt to new consumer habits, like the explosive rise of esports and heavily fragmented digital audiences.
True.
So as sports become increasingly digital, decentralized, and virtual, where algorithms and code actually dictate the rules of the game, what happens to tone from the top?
That is $1 million question.
Right. When there's no physical boardroom, when there is no physical hallway to step out into, and perhaps no human chair sitting at the head of a table,
Yeah.
how will the sports organizations of the future build a culture of integrity?
It is a frontier we are just beginning to navigate. The chalk lines on the virtual field might be perfect, but the digital boardroom is going to be a whole new kind of murky.
It really is. Thank you for joining us at the table today for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Keep questioning the rules of the game both on the field and in the boardroom. Until next time.